Since its inception, if there's one thing people have always cared about in video games, it's the graphics. There's always been a push to make the games look as good as possible and as close to reality as can be. And with newer and more powerful technologies, that has gotten more feasible as time has gone on. That's why we went from this to this. By the time we got to the PS3 and Xbox 360 generation, the push for photorealistic graphics became even greater, and it was at this generation where it finally seemed possible. We had games at the tail end of the console generation, like The Last of Us and Grand Theft Auto V, that really showed how far graphics had come. But even games from earlier in the generation, like God of War 3, proved it was possible to have cutting-edge graphics. And now, almost a couple decades removed from that generation, we are now where we're at today. The peak of video game graphics. In the modern gaming landscape, you don't have to look very far to find video games with near photorealistic graphics, or at the very least, graphics that would have been unthinkable even a decade ago. But now that we've reached the peak of graphics, I think it's important to look at where we came from and the value of old graphics. Specifically, I'm talking about the PlayStation 1 and N64 generation and kind of dovetailing into the PS2 and GameCube. Yes, graphics from this generation are clearly out of date, but there is something special to them that I want to talk about. Just because the graphics of this era are old doesn't mean that the games at the time benefited from them and still do. Take some of Nintendo's old games, like Super Mario 64 and Ocarina of Time. Yes, I, like everybody else, would love full-blown remakes of those games with modern graphics and technology. But that doesn't change the fact that there is a sort of special sauce to the way those games look. The very polygonal and simplistic designs really allow for things like art style to come through. Since you couldn't graphically get across what the developers might have wanted to, they had to rely on the art. Look at a game like Conker's Bad Fur Day, for example. Sure, the remastered version of that game definitely looks more impressive, yet when you go back and compare it to the original version, it's clear that the original version looks better, even though it's older. It's less graphically impressive, and it's got a way lower poly count, but there's something about the art style that just shines through a lot more. And when it comes to old games benefiting from old graphics, look no further than the horror genre. If there was ever a group of games that benefited from old graphics, it would be horror greats like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Take Silent Hill 2, for example. I personally loved the remake we got of it last year. And graphically, the game looks fantastic. And while it does look better than its original, I would argue there's a certain aspect of the game that's kind of lost in the translation to newer and more impressive graphics. Because the original Silent Hill 2 can't just show you in 4K at 60 frames the most scariest thing you've ever seen, it has to scare you in other ways. As a result, the game is more dependent on art style and sound design, and especially atmosphere, to convey what it wants to the player, which in Silent Hill 2's case is scaring the shit out of you. Even Silent Hill, the town itself, benefits from this. For the original Silent Hill games, because they couldn't fully render the entire town, they had to cover it in fog to sort of hide the loading, and as a result we get one of the most iconic and atmospheric locations in all of games. If you want an even clearer picture of how old horror games benefited from old graphics, look at new horror games. While big publishers like Capcom and Konami have sought to remake their old horror games with new cutting-edge graphics, things have been a little different on the indie scene. For a while now, we've been getting indie horror games that harken back to that old school style of graphics, in order to evoke that old school sense of horror. Games like Signalis, Crow Country, and Mouthwashing, just to name a few, all do this. Each of these games, in their own way, adapts a retro style of graphics, and uses those old school graphics to create a tense, atmospheric, and horrifying experience for players, without any of the bells and whistles that people are accustomed to nowadays. And if there's one thing that Capcom and Konami have lost in the remakes of these new games, it's art style. Whereas some of these indie games I just mentioned use the old school graphics and have great art styles. Now, that's not to take anything away from the Silent Hill 2 remake or the Resident Evil remakes. Those games are fucking fantastic. Resident Evil 2 remake, Resident Evil 4 remake, Silent Hill 2 remake. We don't talk about Resident Evil 3 remake. Those three games are fantastic and like all 10 out of 10s. So just because they've lost some of the art style along the way doesn't make them any worse, it just makes them different. But it's an appreciation for old graphics that allows some of these indie games to thrive. So in a way, what I'm trying to say and what I'm looking for in games is art style. Don't get me wrong, I love and appreciate new games with their big AAA budgets and their big fancy AAA graphics. But I want some of that style, you know what I mean? Give me big budget AAA games that look like BioShock Infinite. Psychonauts 2. Overwatch. That's the kind of shit I'm looking for. In short, modern graphics and modern gaming are beyond impressive. But just because we have the new fancy toys doesn't mean we should completely forget about the old stuff. Whether it's old games with old graphics or new games with old school style graphics, there's still a lot to be found and a lot of enjoyment to be had in those old poly graphics. Just maybe not in the old school cutscenes. I mean, have you ever seen some of that pre-rendered stuff from the PS1?
Hello, Harry.
Yikes.